we could point from Tertullian, from Justin Martyr, from Josevius, and even in the Gospel of Luke, and we could harmonize them in the sense to make it that the term that is used for governor, because governor, again, the Greek term for governor is not really governor. Again, it could also be leader, it could also be follower. And a lot of times, a lot of people who look at the New Testament, they look at certain words and have to go back to the Greek in order to identify certain, um, you know, translations. Because obviously, when you're translating the Greek to the English, it doesn't translate the exact same words. There's two, three meanings, four meanings. So in all those meanings, it's also referring to not only as governor, but also as leader or chief in some case.
So I did see that, there was a person that commented in one of your videos last time, and so I did want to honor those we wanted to honor those comments that this person had. So some of the questions that were brought up, and I think these might be a little bit of clarifications for you. Um, so I did see that there was a couple things that were questioned in terms of history, in terms of um
I got some of them highlighted if I'm gonna.
oh, did you highlight them?
Yeah, let's highlight them just because it was quite a bit. So I was like, I'm gonna try to simplify this a little bit. Um, so I could start with something.
Yeah, and I wrote down also some of the questions there, just briefly stating like the questions themselves. Um, I think like one of them, you kind of mentioned it in your in testimony, but when was Jesus born, right? Because Matthew says he was born in 1 year, another one says he was born in another year, and then I think there was also questions in terms of Herod being still alive during Jesus' time. What was he really alive? Was there really a persecution? Um, if you can shed some light into that historical aspect, or how does that combine?
Sure. So the main argument is that in Matthew, we see that Jesus is born in the late years of Herod. And in Luke, there's mention of the first census that was done by a governor at that time by the name of Quirinius, who Quirinius was a governor after Herod's death. So that's mentioned by Josevius, who was a historian in the first century. So the skeptic would say, well, if um, if Jesus was born during the late times of Herod, but then in the other gospel he mentions that he was born during the governorship of Quirinius, that means that it's contradicting itself. How could Christ be born and during the times of Herod, but in also the times of Quirinius, who was a governor after Herod's death? So I think what I first have to state is that one, I think we have to look at the Gospels and more specifically the New Testament as people who are not specifically trying to put evidence in every single thing. Their objective in the Gospels is to bring the good news. So obviously, if they're going to give something such as, a birth or a scenario, they're not going to go so much deep toe in it because obviously the whole message of the gospel was to bring the good news to the people. And the Gospel of Matthew was to bring the good news to the Jewish people, and the Luke was to the Gentiles and through the genealogy. But what we could find also is that there is a connection between that of Matthew and that of Luke. So many scholars have pointed out that whenever Luke 2:2, where it reads that, the first census that was done by Quirinius, the term first doesn't really refer to first, but rather before. The term is used as the genitive Greek case as protos, which, by the way, means before, as it's also mentioned in John 1:15, John 1:30, and John 15:18. This is also proposed by scholars such as N.T. Wright, and also Oxford scholars such as Liddell Scott, as well as the Greek English lexicon of the New Testament by Barr. So all these scholars have pointed out that the Greek verse where it states first is actually before. So technically speaking, if that's the case, then it would match up with the Gospel of Matthew, because the census was done before the governorship of Quirinius. So you see how that ties in, right?
So basically, it's saying that in the Gospel of Luke, the census was done first, meaning it was done before his actual reign.
Correct. So a lot of scholars have pointed out that the term first is misguided. It rather protos, which is the Greek, is actually referred to before, not first. So that's one argument that is done.
So the verse itself is Luke 2:2, or
correct. Luke 2:2. So the term,
and it states,
says,
and what does it say?
It states that like the first census is done under the leadership of Quirinius. So, but before that, scholars have pointed out that the term first, as signifying protos, actually doesn't mean first, but rather it means before. So it will line up with the Gospel of Matthew, because again, Herod was before the governorship of Quirinius. And if the term protos is used before, that means that the census was done before the governorship of Quirinius, which therefore would not contradict both Matthew and Luke.
I see. Yeah. So it says, it's kind of interesting how the translation came to come across as first, primer, because I have a Spanish Bible, and it also says first, or primer. And so it's interesting how the idea comes to be before. How would you say, like, I mean, somebody that doesn't speak Greek and just kind of picks up the Bible, how are they supposed to know that? I mean, I'm sure that through research they can come to the same conclusion, right? But to somebody that's just reading it and says like, well, I didn't know, like, why does it say first then here? Why haven't they changed to before, to the right translation in the Bible?
So it goes back to my other argument that scholars have pointed out. So the term that is used first in Luke actually signifies an historical time period where, first means is the first census. But clearly in Roman times, specifically in the book of the Deeds of Augustus, there were several censuses that were done not only during the time of the governorship of Quirinius, but they were also done way before. So whenever they were referred to the first census, they were referred to the first census under him, but there was also other censuses that were going on throughout the BC era or AD, which again, BC and AD are things that are made later on in order to have some form of connection within history. But in the early era, there was no such thing as AD or BC. So it was just, timeline was there.
Time. Yeah,
exactly. So, for example, the Bible verse where it says, the first census, a lot of scholars have pointed out that when it talks about the first census, as how history points out, specifically by Tertullian, not a church father, but a historian, he points out that at that time, during the time of Herod, the governor was called Syria of Sentius, or Sentius of Saturnius, was the governor during the time of Herod, which was when Christ was born later on. So he made, the emperor made a census, but he didn't complete it yet. So he has not completed that census yet. So because of the fact that there is political complexity in Judah, and also the Jewish resistance of taxation by the Jews themselves over the Romans, which was very, historical during that time. So the census wasn't really brought in until much later in the Gospel of Luke, where it says the first census was under Quirinius. So it kind of ties in the historical framework. But during the times of Herod's reign, as how Justin Martyr points out, another who was actually a church father, he states that Quirinius was actually a procurator during the time of Herod's reign. A procurator is one who gathers money, but is also a leader, but not the governor. So the term that is used for a governor in the Gospel of Luke could be referred to, other interpretations as well. And we see that throughout the New Testament. So, you see sometimes it means 2 or 3 meanings. It means 1, 2, so forth. So in the Gospel of Luke specifically, Justin Martyr argues that Cyrenius, or sorry, more specifically Quirinius, was not the governor, but rather he was the procurator. So, but that's found in Luke, right? And Josephus states that during the time of governorship of Quirinius, he makes a census. So if you look at it from the beginning, if you look at the history, as I pointed out, because it would harmonize not only Luke, but it would harmonize also Josephus, but it would also harmonize Justin Martyr, but it was also harmonized Tertullian, all 4 people. So in
Different
BC,
time periods?
Sort of. Like, for example, Josephus was during the 1st century. Luke was in the 1st century. Justin Martyr was in the mid 2nd century, and
First century.
Tertullian
Okay. Yeah.
was in the beginning of the 3rd century. So it would harmonize all 4 historians at that point: Luke, Josephus, Justin Martyr, and Tertullian. Because obviously, if we take Josephus' account that, the governorship was under Quirinius and he did the census, he would be also contradicting not only Luke, but he would also be contradicting Justin Martyr and Tertullian. And we will have a problem also with that. And obviously, why would we also trust Josephus as well? It's not as though, he's infallible in any way, shape, or form. And specifically, a lot of historians have pointed out that his writings are also misleading because he uses he changes a lot of time periods. One specific thing that is found within the Antiquities book that is found in Josephus is that he mentions the affairs of Pilate in the beginning of 27 AD, but then he goes on and states the incident of the Temple of Isis in 1980. So he changes a lot of dates within his book. So even going to the Skeptic and saying Josephus is a reliable historian may not be reliable if he's always changing the time periods within his book in the late antiquities. Now, I would say it's more of a harmonization rather than stating that Josephus was wrong, Luke was wrong, Justin Martyr was wrong, Tertullian was wrong. So that not only is the Christians right, but also the Jewish scholars, which was Josephus. So how I laid it out, and many scholars have laid it out, this argument is that during BC, which is Herod's reign, the governor was Saturnius, as how Tertullian mentions. But under Saturnius, it's Quintarius, who was found in Luke. He was
who's the one that they mentioned was under the census.
Exactly. So he's the one that actually made the census under Augustus. So Augustus is the one that sent Quirinius to make the census during the time that the governor Sentius Saturnius was there. So if you if you put that together, Matthew and Luke don't contradict themselves. But then you would say, well, wouldn't it contradict Josephus? No, it won't. If we see that much later on, through the the high ranking positions, Quirinius becomes a governor later on, and he makes a census at the same time later on. It wouldn't contradict Josephus, because again, when we see Josephus writing, he doesn't mention that the first census was done under Quirinius. He just says that there was a census done by Quirinius. Does that make sense?
You explain that one more time? Just
Yes. So in Josephus' work, when he refers to Quirinius as being the governor, and he also talks about the census, he doesn't talk about that the same as Luke, where Luke talks about the first. He states that Quirinius just made a census. So therefore, it could be possible that he was a person under Augustus and under the governors of Saturnius during the late BC, which was the time period that Jesus was born. But then later on,
during the time
because
that
of ranking,
Herod was reigning too.
Exactly. And during later on, he, through his rise of power, he became a governor and he made another census. And we know that because again, I mentioned in the deeds of Augustus, he makes different census. He doesn't only make one census. He makes census in 28 BC, 8 BC, 14 AD. And he also makes it locally as well. So it would also be referred to Judea as well. So, but that's also found in the deeds of Augustus. So instead of like contradicting Josephus, instead of contradicting Justin Martyr and Luke, we could harmonize all four individual people in the manner that I've explained.
And so in terms of dates, because people I guess, like, is there a time or a date where Herod actually lived, like an actual, does that coincide with Jesus's birth?
Yeah,
Because
I mean, we
I
see
think from what I had seen is that he didn't, in fact, he was ill at the end of his life, but he was still alive in some,
Well, he was still alive, and I mean, he basically died, not so quick or not fast, but during his late years, that's when Jesus was born. And then after that, in the beginning of AD, is when Quirinius became governor. So Herod was in the late BC during the times of Jesus' birth, but then he died before the governorship of Quirinius. That's how we know that from Josephus.
Yeah, and so Jesus was born in the late BC. Is that what you're saying?
He was not like in the late BC in the sense of,
I think the commentator was saying that, and maybe you can explain a little bit, that in one of the gospels he was born during 1 AD, and then in the other one he was born in 4 AD, and so he wasn't. He was actually born in BC. Could you explain that a little bit?
So as far as I know, with the commentator, he mentions that he says that Jesus was born in Matthew in 3 BCE, and in Luke he was born in 6 CE. So clearly during the times of 3 BCE, Herod was in his last reign, in his last life, but Jesus was still born in that same time period. Later on, when Quirinius became governor, that was in 6 CE. So Jesus was actually born in estimation. Again, we estimate the time 4 BCE, 3 BCE, around that time. Yeah. Again, we don't also think that AD or BC has anything to do with Jesus in a way. Not as though before Christ or AD was a conclusion that historians have pointed out. That's just a way for us to figure out a much easier path of the historical timeline.
Right. It's like a tool kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's why, like, in the emperors themselves are the emperors of basically a lot of provinces from western to eastern. Then you have, kings who are by and large under the emperor. Then you have, governors and so forth.
Okay, so King Herod was reigning, and then during that time, what's his name? The governor. The governor during that time was Carino, or
Well, I would say from all
or
four.
during his last days.
Yeah. So during his last days, um, more than likely Jesus was born, and during that same years, as how, for example, Tertullian as well as Saint Justin Martyr point out, is that more than likely the governor is Sentius Saturnius, who was the governor at that time, but under him was the procurator Quirinius, who was the one in charge of the money and so forth. But later on, after Herod's death, through the rise of power, he became a governor. And in Josephus' work, he mentions that during his time as governor, he made a census. So, but notice again, as I mentioned before, in Josephus' work, nor does it mention that he made the first census. He just made a census, and as how I point out,
meaning that it could have been that first one.
Yeah.
So he had already initiated while he was a procurator.
Exactly. He already did one where he's already a procurator, but later on he made another one while he was a governor.
And so when it says, so we already explained the fact that it says the first census was made while Quirinius was governor. So how does that translate? Because we just translated the word first, but in the sentence in itself, it almost seems that the first census was made during Quirinius' time, but
Correct.
But in fact it wasn't. It was how can we describe or dissect this sentence? I think you kind of did it, but it's just not clicking, because it says Quirinius is governor. It is saying that it was first. So how does that imply that it was the first one while he was a procurator, but here it says he was governor?
Yes. So with the Greek translation of first, a lot of Greek scholars have mentioned that it becomes before, but that's another argument as well. There's also Greek scholars who don't hold to that position. So some hold to the position that first, governor is actually correct in Luke 2:2. But even though it says that Quirinius was the first governor, we could point from Tertullian, from Justin Martyr, from Josephus, and even in the Gospel of Luke, and we could harmonize them in the sense to make it that the term that is used for governor, because governor, again, the Greek term for governor is not really governor. Again, it could also be leader, it could also be follower. And a lot of times, a lot of people who look at the New Testament, they look at certain words and have to go back to the Greek in order to identify certain, translations. Because obviously, when you're translating the Greek to the English, it doesn't translate the exact same words. There's 2, 3 meanings, 4 meanings. So in all those meanings, it's also referring to not only as governor, but also as leader or chief in something. So in that case, as Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and even harmonizing Josephus and Luke, we could say that Quirinius was a procurator during the time of Herod's reign, but the governor was Sentius Saturnius. Later on, because he was a procurator, he rose to power, became a governor later on, Therefore, he made his own census, which is what Josephus points out. So it's
Would
more
that
like
be the second census?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Meaning that
because
the first census that is described here in Luke, that was the first census that effectively Quirinius had made, but the word governor implies leader or procurator during that time.
Yeah, it doesn't really refer to governor so much. It could also refer to chief or leader and so forth. So the term governor is used as a way to, you know, more for the English, but when you're translating Greek to English, it's not always going to direct the same words. Sometimes there can be 3, 4, 5 words that mean the same thing. The same with any other ancient language. So at that time, again, as I mentioned, in Luke, he says he is the governor, but it could be that it says first procurator or the first chief, which he would be under Herod's reign, under procurator, and he would be doing the census. That's the reason why in Luke 2 it says that he does the first census, and that's why he says first census. Then, because the term first census is very interesting. So why would he say he does the first census as well, if he's never done a census to begin with? So the first census is under his job as a procurator. Later on, he becomes a governor, and as Josephus points out, under his governorship, he does a census, another census. And again, I mentioned, and during the times of the Romans, they did different census every year. It's not as though it's limited to one, but every year they do a global census. They do also a local census as well.
Okay. And so when we're saying the first census, we also said that it could also refer to before, right? Some scholars have said that it could be the meaning before. So either
Yes.
way, if it was the first one or it was the one before Quirinius, if we look at the other writers, right, the other historians, that's what we can base ourselves on to understand this text, right?
Right. So what scholars have pointed out is that you could use the Greek view of first being before, but then you could also look at the history and state that even though it states first, you could still find historical documents in order to provide the argument that, the first census that is done under Quirinius was done under him being the procurator, and then later on him being a governor in Josephus' works. So either or, you could use any argument, but those two arguments validate not only the harmonization between Matthew and Luke, but also harmonize also Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Josephus, and so forth. So I think, to me, it's much better argument, because obviously you're not excluding one historian, but you're adding all historians put together.
Yeah, different historians that kind of conclude to the same idea, right?
Corroborating it.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and kind of going off of that a little bit. Another question that was mentioned by our friend was that yes, there was this census going on when Jesus was born, right? He had to go, but why did Mary have to go with Joseph to the counting of the census while she was pregnant, right? While she was pregnant, knowing that was a long trip, knowing that Mary was going to be, in need of help, right? Like, why didn't she just decide to stay back?
Well, it's because of the prophecy that is found in the Old Testament, as well as when the Magi went to Herod, they mentioned that the prophecy of the Old Testament. So when the Magi went to Herod, they said, we come to see Christ. Then Herod also, has the understanding of the elders, or what they would say the Pharisees or so forth. It just depends on what your interpretation of that is. And they're going back to him, Herod telling him that there was a prophecy in Bethlehem and so forth. So the prophecy is why Mary herself had to go to Bethlehem. Now, the bigger question is, how do we know that prophecy exists? Well, that's actually a different question. But from an historical point of view, the prophecy that is found in the Old Testament from a typological form is the reason why they had to go to Bethlehem, which is the lineage of Joseph, to be honest, because Joseph is from Bethlehem. And that's the reason why he also had to go back to Bethlehem in order to do the census, because obviously, if you're originally from a country, during the census, you have to go and, do the census with your household and so forth in your original home. That's how he points out, where he states that, why is he going all the way to Bethlehem but not Nazareth?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, to be honest, because he's from Bethlehem, not because of the fact that he lives in Nazareth at that point, but he's from Bethlehem, and that's why he has to go back to Bethlehem.
Yeah, because there's a point. Yeah, and there's a point made about, I think it's related to that, where he said, why would they go to a dangerous place? The commentator said, where one of Herod's sons was ruling over the area of Bethlehem, and then the area of Nazareth. So why would they say there's arguing that'd be dangerous for them to go there, kind of thing.
Well,
and and also, I think one of the commentator kind of mentions, like, there's 20 generations maybe, or several generations. How would Joseph know to go back to Bethlehem? Was that just a thing that they knew?
Well, it's not so much that's generational. He knew the generational thing, but like I mentioned before, he's from Bethlehem. Not so much that he lives in Nazareth, but he's from Bethlehem. So he has to go back to Bethlehem for the census.
And why were they in Nazareth? Was that where Mary was from? Or
yeah.
So it's kind of like going back to your hometown.
Yeah, so he has to go back to the hometown in order for the census, because obviously the Romans would have a census be based on your original home. So that's the reason why he would have to go to Bethlehem for the census, but he would also go back to Bethlehem for the prophecy and so forth. Now, you mentioned something about the sons of Herod, that they were still ruling at the other parts. Interesting enough, Herod himself is a very disturbed man if you look at Josephus' work, as well as historians, So there's a doctor by the name of Dr. Mayer, who served as a historian of ancient history at Western Michigan University. He points out that Herod was very barbaric and was very tyrant. So he would kill any person that he would see. He would even kill his sons.
Oh, wow.
Because during his end of reign, he got very complexity within his mind that he started to kill not only his sons, but his favorite wife as well. So clearly, it wouldn't be so much of an issue if they would go to one of the province of the sons, because they were already in conflict with each other in that
Plus,
point.
It would be interesting to see it, not only that they have that conflict, but, how do they know Joseph or Jesus is the actual savior during that time?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's interesting.
And, what was another thing that I was thinking, during the census, why didn't Mary just stay and do the census in Nazareth, since she's in Nazareth? Why did she have to go with Joseph to Bethlehem? Was that patriarchal, or?
It's mostly done by prophecy that was found in the Old Testament to the New. So whenever I mentioned the Magi went to Herod and said, like, why are you here? I come to see the Christ. And the ones who were near Herod, who were the scribes or the Pharisees, were telling him, it's is Christ who was prophesied in the Old Testament. So even in the New Testament, it's referring to going back to the prophecy of the Old Testament. So it's prophecy in itself. Because again,
but did they just fulfill the prophecy like naturally, or did or they knew like, oh, okay, well, Mary and Joseph were like, wow, we're gonna have the son of Jesus, like, let's just go to Bethlehem? Or was it just like, did it just happen because of the ruler asking for the census?
Well, this,
Is it
yeah.
more the fact that they themselves knew that they had to fulfill the prophecy, or that it just happened to naturally?
Well, even before, when the angel comes to Mary herself, and also the angel later on goes with Joseph, the angel explains to him the significance about, the Mary's child and so forth. So even before then, they knew that it was going to be risky, the journey, because it was stated by an angel.
So the angel told told them that they had to go to Bethlehem, or
Yeah. So, for example, it goes back to the typological framework that is found in the Old Testament. But even before then, the angel that was said to Mary and the angel that is said to Joseph, they gave them directions in order to figure out where to go and so forth, which is a fulfillment of the Old Testament, as we see from any typological framework of the Old Testament.
because when the angel comes to Mary, I mean, the angel reveals to Mary who she's going to be and who she's going to receive in her womb, right? But I don't think they explicitly said, hey, just remember the prophecy, it has to be born in Bethlehem, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm guessing during that time when she received the prophecy, she was in Nazareth, where she's from.
Correct.
Joseph, being from Bethlehem, was there with her, getting ready for marriage, proposing, and all that.
Correct.
And so I'm just trying to think, like, did them having to go to Bethlehem, where Joseph is from, did that happen because Joseph might have been like, hey, I need Mary to come with me, because if the baby's born, I want it to be born with me, not in my absence? Or was it because what was the other aspect? I mean, I'm trying to just think about that.
Yeah, because I mean, the fact is that, and this goes back to the concept of, like, if the Gospels don't mention them, therefore it's false. A lot of skeptics have pointed out that, so if the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Matthew don't mention a certain event, then that means it's false automatically. Well, no, not necessarily, implied that. Obviously, the typological framework that is found within the Old Testament is known to even them, as well as even the scribes, because they're Jewish. So the stories of the Old Testament were said to them again and again. And when they mention, the birth of Christ, in their mind, clearly that would indicate a typological framework. They would connect those two things and will refer to Bethlehem. But I would say, yeah, I would agree that at some point he did want, Jesus to be born while he was with Mary.
Because I'm trying to think if it's something like cultural, where the dad, the parent has to be present there. Just I mean, that's something that might be for further research, but that's one of the things that I was just kind of questioning, because I think I have sometimes the trouble almost saying it's almost like Shakespeare, when Macbeth, in the play Macbeth, there's supposedly he was gonna be killed by somebody that was not of a woman. And
Correct.
so they're like, well, I can never die, because no, everybody has to come from a woman. But then there was this person that was born in some different way. They had to do cut them up open, and so they were born differently, not of woman, but out of abnormal birth, and so therefore fulfilling the prophecy. So I was trying to think that, what did they really know like, hey, I need to go to Bethlehem so that the baby's born there, and also I have to go there for the census? Or was it because I have to go for the census and it's a tradition or a cultural aspect to have my baby, my wife's baby, be born with me? I
I
don't
would
know.
say it's
Or maybe to protect Mary, knowing that what type of baby was going to be born, the son of God.
yeah. I think also by the Proto-Evangelium, which is a document that is found in the 1st and 2nd century, uh, Joseph is in that record is as a protector. So that goes along with what you're stating as him being the protector of Mary and Jesus. So it kind of ties in that perspective of being the protector. But overall, he had to go over there to get the census. But again, it goes back to the perception of typology, where the Old Testament states the prophecy of Bethlehem. And even though there's no, Bethlehem saying there, doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't actually know about it. Again, they probably heard stories of the Old Testament every single day because, again, the Jewish culture was
Yeah,
profoundly
they were probably very
binational.
Jewish, knew.
So,
And so,
but again, that goes with the Proto-Evangelium, which is a document that states that um, Joseph as being a protector.
yeah. And so I guess I'm coming to an understanding that, Mary and Joseph themselves were very Jewish in practice, right? So they knew, the prophecies very well, to the point when they realized, like, hey, Jesus, or like, not, God is going to come in human form. He's going to be the savior. We know from reading that the savior has to be born, where David's lineage was, right? Or be born in Bethlehem. And
Yes,
so
absolutely.
that's where we have to go. Plus there's also the census, so might as well, let's just go there. This is a sign from God to bring us back to where we were, almost to say that, right? Maybe they did have that realization that the prophecy was being fulfilled in them, almost to say, like, whoa, like, you piece two things together if you hear that that is actually going to be the Christ, and that the Christ is going to be born in Bethlehem. Plus they're making you go to Bethlehem because of the census. Then it just puts two and two. So, like, well, okay, Mary, then in that case you have to come with me so that it is born over there, and at the same time I'll go there for the census.
Yeah, so it's everything. Basically, just the same way as how when I was arguing about the Matthew and Luke's um, nativity birth, where there's a contradiction between the senses and so forth. You could see patterns of, for example, it could be this thing and combined with this and combined with this. And then this is something that you see within the Gospels, where it's not just one thing, but many different things. Jesus was not only died for resurrection, like he didn't die just for the sins, but he also died to proclaim his kingship of him being God. But then there's also the concept where he died because he himself was waging, war with the devil since the beginning of Genesis. So looking at it from that perspective, yeah, you can make that conclusion as well.
And in that regard, in terms of those things that you just mentioned, it almost seems like the different writers of the Gospels, it's almost like those differences come up in a sense of interpretation of events. Maybe like how we talked about before, people can go to the same place, but have a different interpretation of the same event. And
Correct.
put more emphasis on one thing or another.
Yes. So it's going back to the viewer, like if I was in an event, so for example, all three of us were in an event. I write about specifically details about the event. And maybe in that event there is a band, but I never write that there is a band. But maybe you write that there is a band.
Right.
And then Jose could write that there is people doing art, crafts, and so forth. Doesn't necessarily imply that I'm contradicting Jose or you, but rather that we're looking at it from a different view. And we have to see that from the Gospels as well, because Matthew was looking at it from a different view than Luke was.
It was also writing to a different crowd.
That's true. And they all have different lives. And maybe I picked
Correct.
up on something that you didn't pick up on. And when you put them together, though, then it starts to make sense, as we've been kind of mentioning. And then also like the idea of like, oh, they kind of, what they took from Jesus' sacrifice was to fight the devil. Maybe someone else took something else from the sacrifice, that he was doing it for another reason. And so I don't see that as a contradiction. I just see it as people experiencing and interpreting the events of Jesus in different ways. And so, yeah, there was one other thing that this commenter mentioned that I thought was particularly interesting. They said the first gospel was written at earliest a minimum of 27 years after the alleged death of Jesus. And according to that, Jesus either died in 31 CE or 33 CE. And the Gospel of Mark was no earlier than 60 CE, but most likely after 70 CE. So they were saying that you were saying the gospel was written 10 to 20 years after the alleged death of Jesus. They were saying that maybe you were thinking about Paul's letters, which were 17 years to 33 years after. And they were kind of going on and saying there's no eyewitnesses or contemporary writings of Jesus during his life. And I guess for those reasons.
Okay. So we have to also bear in mind, and as I mentioned in the last podcast, that in that specific time period, it was an oral tradition. So not a lot of things were written. Jewish writers did a lot of oral language, as well as Greek, Romans, and so forth. So, and then at that time period, we don't have that much record of a lot of historical figures. As he points out with Alexander the Great, we know a lot of his information 200 to 300 years right after his death. As he points out, the documents of Anabasis of Alexander, the life of Alexander the Great, and so forth. We have a lot of information of Alexander the Great from Plutarch, but that wasn't until 300 years, 200 years after his death. So compare that to Jesus, who was, maybe 30. You could even conclude that Mark was in AD 60, but still that's 30 years, 28 years after his death, which is pretty close. Compare that to, for example, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and so forth. So the closeness of the Gospels to Jesus is, doesn't compare to, for example, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar.
And it's not to say that they didn't exist, right? But it just goes to show that these writings and Gospels are so much closer in times of being after the death of the event or of Jesus.
That's the important point to make, because what I'm hearing is it's the same process, the oral tradition, as Alexander the Great or Caesar or Jesus. It's the same process in terms of how it was recorded in history. So it's like, well, if we're going to question Jesus, why don't we question the same process that was used for Caesar and Alexander? I mean, it was the exact same, but it was a similar process of oral tradition. And then, like you said, what's even more interesting is that it was closer, the oral tradition and the writing into when Jesus and concerning him, compared to Alexander the Great or Caesar. So that's important to point out for sure.
Was there also more writings? I think that's one of the things that
they're asking. The person asking if there are other writings, except because they were saying it was only recorded in the Gospels and stuff like that.
So we have from non-Christian sources Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, and Flavius of Josephus. Now, he mentions that Josephus' accounts of Jesus was corrupted. I just don't see that anywhere where it's corrupted, because obviously if he assumes that Josephus' accounts are corrupted, then he will also has to refer to his argument about the census of Josephus to be corrupted as well, and other writings of Josephus to be corrupted. So, but I wouldn't say that Josephus was corrupted the same way as I wouldn't say that he was corrupted in him giving the census of Quirinius. I think it all comes together. Some historians have pointed out that Josephus was a contradicting historian because of different dates, but I just don't see that as true, because they could harmonize the same way as how it was harmonized with Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Luke, and him. There's other writings, like I said, Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Flavius, who were in the 1st century and early 2nd century that talk about Jesus. There's also the Gospels. There's also the Didache, which is the first catechism ever made, which was in the late first century, early second century. Clement's letter to the Corinthians, late first century, early second century. Letter of
Mentions
Barnabas.
Jesus as well.
I'm sorry?
These writings mention Jesus.
Yes, they all mention Jesus and so forth. So we have actually much closer, because Clement of Corinthians, the Didache, letter of Barnabas, Ignatius of Antioch, letter of the Polycarp, Shepherd of Hermas, are all found within the late first century or early second century, mid second century, which are much closer to the writings that are found in Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and so forth. And not only that, we have, again, 5,000 manuscripts. We also have in different languages the New Testament in Greek and Coptic and Hebrew and Aramaic and Latin and so forth. So we have an abundance evidence of Jesus. Even, again, Bart Ehrman, who's a very skeptic in the Gospels, who, the first argument that I made about Justin Martyr and so forth, he would probably go against that. But even he states that, there is a lot of history of the existence of Jesus in the early church as well as in late antiquity. Again, like I said, I don't deny the existence of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. I do think that those people are in themselves were living in those times. Obviously, they've made an impact, but Christianity was very impactful even now with Jesus.
Yeah, definitely. The only other question that I didn't even realize this actually myself. The commentator was pointing out that Jesus could not do mighty work in his hometown, I believe, where they knew him as family, and that he decided not to do it, not because it was because of how they received him, and he could just not do miracles for some reason, because there was a handful of people not believing him to be a god. And so they're questioning, well, if he's omnipotent and he's powerful, then why can't he perform miracles whenever he wants to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the Gospel of Matthew himself, he also, for example, whenever he doesn't do some miracles, he knows exactly the other individual's heart and mind. I think that's in a way a miracle, because obviously human beings cannot read minds or cannot read hearts. So we kind of have to look back and say, okay, maybe it's not some miracle where he could turn water into wine, but it's something that he could read thoughts, or he could read the heart, which is something that humans don't have the capacity to do. Not only that, but Jesus, and throughout the other Gospels, he does miracles left and right. He feeds, many people fishes and so forth. So it's kind of like a how would I say this? A lot of skeptics have stated that if Jesus doesn't do one thing in one gospel, then that means the gospel is wrong. But again, the concept of silence in the gospels, just because Jesus didn't provide a big miracle, doesn't necessarily imply that he himself cannot make big miracles. It's the same thing as, for example, me or any other figure. If I have the ability to, let's just say, drive a car, and I'm writing to you that I'm in the car, testing out the car, but I haven't driven the car. Does that mean that I don't have the ability to drive the car? No. It just means that at that point, just the same way as in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is depicted in a certain way. So again, he's also mentioned to the Jewish audience, and a lot of the Jewish audience didn't have faith as well. We have to also bear that in mind, because they were very doubtful. A lot of the converts were mostly Gentiles as well. So Matthew was recording it from a perspective to the Jewish people who did not have faith.
So that's important to have.
Yeah. And even I think you and I, Edgar, had discerned this a little bit further. And, the fact that, it couldn't have been magic, he couldn't have been doing magic in other places, not only because whenever he did a miracle, sometimes he didn't even use words, which in magic, you have to do a whole process of invoking and saying verbal comments to create magic, right? And that's where witchcraft and stuff like that kind of stem from. But it couldn't have been doing magic in other places. And then in his hometown, they are like, yeah, this is the carpenter's son. He can't do he's not gonna fool us, right? No, it wasn't that, because we see that miracles were happening without him saying a word. And not only that, even in one of the gospels, it says, if a lot of people were saying, well, no, he does this by the name of Beelzebub, meaning the devil, right? Which is, the foundation of where a lot of witchcraft comes from. And he says, if this came from the devil, then the kingdom of the devil wouldn't cast out its own demons, right? This would be a kingdom divided, and a kingdom divided would not stand. And so how could you say that I'm doing this from Beelzebub or the devil? And so even at that, it goes to show that he wasn't doing magic, right? But to the point that Edgar was saying, it was because of their faith that they didn't believe, that they couldn't see past his reality of being a carpenter, that they couldn't perform miracles there. Not that he couldn't perform them, but that he didn't perform them, because the people of the community, even if he did do them, they would not believe, right? And so there was no need to do them, right? He couldn't perform because they didn't believe, right? Or more to say, he didn't perform because they didn't believe. He already knew. And so he does that in various parts of the gospel. He says, nah, I'm not, you guys are asking for miracles, but you're not going to see any miracle because you guys don't believe. He even says it to
the thing is,
to others.
whenever I read those things that I remember when he did those things, I always interpret it as like, well, he's like, I'm not a show off. Like, I'm not a monkey. I'm not a trained monkey. I'm not here to, that's not my calling. That's not the reason why God has me here, and why I am here as a form of God is not to impress people and just do miracles by your bidding. There's a deeper reason for me to be here. And the miracles he did had, at least I felt like they had a deeper meaning than just trying to do magic tricks and show off in front of people,
Okay,
Yes.
so you were telling us, Edgar, that there was a little bit more comments that you had prepared for our friend to kind of share a little bit more clarity.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I want to mention is just that, again, if there is an omission on an account of the gospel, because the gospel doesn't talk about it, doesn't necessarily imply that the gospel is wrong. Let's just say some scenario that the gospel contradicts, in certain point. That doesn't necessarily imply that the whole gospel is wrong. That's the same way as when they look at the history. Historians and even writers may make mistakes for certain events, but that doesn't necessarily make that the whole book or the whole gospel is false. But even though I don't believe the gospel is false, I do think it harmonizes, like I mentioned with Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and Luke and Josephus. But just from an historical point of view, there's a lot of documents that maybe certain events might be incorrect, but from an historical point, that doesn't necessarily imply that the whole message of the document or even the whole document itself is false.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to mention before, because he says that, and he mentions the Gospel of Mark, though we do have the Gospel of, or more specifically, 1 Corinthians, to be actually even much more earlier than the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of the Corinthians is actually dated around 40 to 45 AD by scholars, as well as James, the letter of James as well. So we have also two documents that are even much earlier than that of the Gospel of Mark, which is around 40 to 45 AD. Though I don't agree that Mark was actually in 60 AD. The reason why is because when we look at the chronological order, we see that Mark was written first, then Luke, then Matthew, then John. So, but then again, more specifically, we look at the Gospel of Luke. And the same writer who wrote the Gospel of Luke wrote Acts, the book of Acts. So Luke wrote Luke before he wrote Acts. And specifically in the Gospel of Acts, and if his chronological view is correct, the Gospel of Acts would be around 80 or so, because obviously Luke would be around 70. Though that would probably not be correct. One, because again, in the Gospel of Acts, they don't show the martyrdom of James, which was in the 60 AD, Paul and Peter. All three church leaders died in AD 60. So if the Gospel of Acts was written around 70 AD, why wouldn't they mention the three church leaders' death? I mean, that's pretty big significance. Not only that, but the book of Acts mentioned a martyrdom that happened with Stephen, but they don't mention, the great leaders. So that seems a little bit far-fetched. Not only that, but when the book of Acts ends, it ends with Paul being in house arrest. Now, if Acts was written around late 70 or early 80, it would have ended in stating that Paul died, because clearly Paul died around 60, but it stopped in his arrest. So a lot of scholars have pointed out that because of those events, even Nero's persecution around the mid-60s were not even found in the book of Acts, which clearly gives us a big indication, because the book of Acts gives us a lot of events that happen to the Jewish people. So why didn't they mention Nero's persecution as well that happened in the 60s if it was written in late 70s or early 80s? So scholars give a point that, the book of Acts was more than likely written during the 60 AD. So that makes Luke to be written in 50 AD. Not only that, but we have, for example, again, the Dead Sea Scrolls are very unique, because obviously when the Dead Sea Scrolls come about, we have more information about texts and so forth. And we do actually have text that is found from the Gospel of Mark that was actually dated in 50 AD. So by the historian, Jesuit historian. So again, even with stating that we have a gospel that is found in 50 AD,
based
there is
on
also,
the Dead Sea Scrolls.
well, the findings of what found after the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also just findings everywhere else that are found, because not only are we finding things from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we're also finding from also archaeological evidence. So every year or every 5 years and so forth, we do uncover a lot more manuscripts of the New Testament. As I mentioned in our last podcast, there's 5,000 manuscripts. But again, when archaeology is done, we find a lot more evidence of society, not only of the New Testament, but we find evidence of other people as well. So in that regards, we also have, for example, the Gospel of Mark that is actually found in 50 AD by, again, the Jesuit priest by the name of Jose Calan. I don't know if hopefully I'm not naming him wrong, but they found
So
the
he was an archaeologist or
theologian and so forth, but he found the evidence that was in 50 AD.
based on what? Where did he find that evidence, or the scriptures, or the?
Well, he found it in archaeological evidence that people find throughout when they do archaeology in the Middle East. So whenever archaeologists dug, because there's a lot of resources or a lot of evidence that people still need
So
to.
he found that the document was dated
in 50
So
AD.
they were
Yes.
they were already using the AD system during that time.
No. I'm mentioning AD in the sense of like, as a
our
way,
correlation of
our correlation, but it would be around 50, 20 years after Jesus has died
wow.
or resurrected, as we believe. But if that's the case, again, like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, doesn't really compare to, it's not that much as compared to other late antiquity.
Yeah, it's like 100 years, like the others. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so, I mean, even with like, let's just say, Plutarch itself was a big writer on Alexander the Great, but again, he wrote in 200, 300 years after. You know who wrote 200 years, 300 years after Jesus? Church fathers who extensively written about theology of the Eucharist, theology of the papacy, so theology of the Trinity. So Jesus is found in 200, in the 200s and 300s, with all church fathers and even Jewish scholars during that time as well.
Yeah, below the 100 mark too. Yeah, that's what's so cool about it.
Yes. So he mentioned also the contradiction that is found where Jesus was born he was born in the manger, but then he was born in a room. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I think that's.
Oh yeah, he was born in a manger or born in a house like room. Yeah.
Born house. So yeah, the Gospel of Matthew relates that he was born in a house, while the Gospel of Luke says he was born in a manger. So he says he couldn't be born in two places. Well,
Yeah.
Again, as I point out, people do have to go back to the Greek because not everything translates, automatic. There's 4 or 3 different meanings. So whenever they talk about, the inn in Gospel of Luke, it's actually referred to, a better term would be a room per se, a guest room. So Greek scholars have pointed out that the term that is used in Luke is used as the guest room, not so much, the inn. They call it the inn again because the things when they translate, they don't translate precise. But then when you look at the Greek, it's translated as kataluma, which was referred to as with Greek scholars as guest room. So notice that it's a guest room. Now, historians and the Jewish historians have pointed out that when Jewish people travel from one place to another, they take families, they take caravans, which is another argument that he made where like, how could a pregnant woman be on a donkey and so forth? Well, they took caravans. They took a lot of people with them. It's not as though they were by themselves, because obviously if they were by themselves, they would get robbed, they would be killed. So at that time, Jewish people would be in groups going to certain places. So again, the whole donkey situation wouldn't really apply if a lot of people, such as caravans, would be going from one place to another. So when they would go over there, they would usually stay in their family's home. But as it mentions, there was no room in the inn. So they had to go to what? Historically, from the Jewish perspective, the guest room or the second floor. So during that time, a lot of the animals were brought in the guest room. Remember, I mentioned in the last podcast that specifically the times in Judea during the cold, animals wouldn't be outside because the cold would be too much to handle. So the animals would be brought in. So normally the animals would be brought in the house, but not in where the people would normally stay, but in the guest room and so forth. So because again, not many people could afford so many houses, so therefore they had to bring in the animals. And that's where the manger perspective comes in, is where he was born in a manger, which is in the second floor were the animals. Again, we also have this perception also, which is I kind of find, I'm not saying it irritates, but like I kind of find it to be ironic that they get the perception of Christ's birth relating to Christmas movies and so forth. And a lot of times that's not the case. A lot of things that are in the Christmas movies of Christ's birth is not really identical to actually from the Bible.
The historical reality of it. Yeah.
Correct.
True.
So
that's pretty interesting. So when it says there was no room in the inn, right? No room in the house of his relatives, right?
So they had to stay in the second room.
Mm-hmm. They had to stay in the room where the animals slept.
Correct. And it's obvious that there was no room because obviously families would be all gathered and there wouldn't be sometimes rooms for a lot of people. So they would have to go into the second room. And that's where the whole perspective of the manger comes about. So Matthew and Luke don't contradict themselves. Again, they harmonize with one another. The same way as how with the concept of the birth of Jesus, they don't contradict themselves, but they harmonize with one another. Even the historians will harmonize each other as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
So interesting. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there was another question in terms of the Magi's, the three wise king. Right. They saw the star, right? And there's in the movies, right, Christmas movies, you see the Magi's following the star almost to the point where it's kind of like leading them, right? But I think Edgar, you had an interesting point on that too. If you don't mind sharing.
Yes. So again, it goes back to the movies where they see the star and they follow the star. But in reality, that's not the gospel. Doesn't actually depict them following the star. They saw the star in the east, but they never followed the star.
Uh-huh. So it never says they follow the star.
I know that. That was interesting.
Yeah. So, but again, it's this presupposition that people have whenever they see Christmas movies and they assume that actually goes, but it's not related to the theology or the Bible.
Closer in the Bible to see. Yeah.
So, but you were saying that the Magi were from the east and they saw the star in the east, which was where they lived, right? And that was an indication, since they studied the stars, that was an indication like, hey, we don't have, they weren't saying like, we have to go to the east. They were saying like, hey, the Savior is going to be born because we're in the east. We see the star in the east, right? Meaning we have to go to Bethlehem, which is in the west.
It's like a sign.
Well, they go to Judea, and once they go to with King Herod, King Herod advises his elders, or the Kohanims, or they're called in the New Testament, and they tell them about the prophecy that had happened in Bethlehem. So at that point, they go to Bethlehem.
Yeah. So basically, these Magi, they go to the leader of the region to explain why they were there.
Correct.
To eventually find, the Savior.
Correct. I think the main proposition is that nowhere is it found in the Gospels where it states that they follow the star as how it's in the Christmas movies.
Yeah. They saw the star in the east and they were in the east, but they never followed the star. Yeah, that's so interesting.
Correct. I want to mention something else about Herod, where he mentions that there's no evidence of him killing babies. So again, it goes back to the Dr. Mayer, who's a professor of history of ancient history at Western Michigan. He points out that Herod himself was cruel and barbaric. He killed his sons, he killed his wife, he killed people left and right. So clearly, if the story of the babies was not included in other historians, it would not really make any difference. I mean, the guy was basically a murderer. Not only that, but he mentions that in Bethlehem specifically, it's a small little village as compared to, for example, Judea and so forth. So he says that, you know, it wouldn't be hundreds and hundreds of babies getting killed in Bethlehem. It would be a small amount of babies getting killed in Bethlehem. Because again, Bethlehem is not as a big province. It's a small province. So they wouldn't even have hundreds of babies. Even that, but you will also have not only male babies, but you would have female babies been born as well in a small section of Bethlehem. So the reason also why it's not depicted in historians is because, again, a little village that size to have hundreds of boy babies and 2-year-olds doesn't, it's not really significant as compared to other acts that Herod did that were much more cruel.
Doesn't stand out much. Yeah.
Correct.
Interesting. Yeah. Nice. Well, I'm not sure if there's any last thoughts that you want to leave us with, Edgar.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there's a lot of historiosity. Even the things that I've talked about, it's just a small portion of how much the New Testament has. You know, obviously, my information is from scholars themselves. I didn't, you know, again, I'm not a scholar, but I got it from scholars themselves who have studied the New Testament from the Greek language to the history and so forth. So anything that I myself might have missed or even slightly did not say, other scholars of Christianity have said it even more so.
Yeah,
but again,
it's almost like the questions that we have of the Bible or Jesus have already been thought, right? Just because it's human nature, I think it's even been thought since like after Jesus' death, right? So there was a lot of things that were discussed, you know, and so it's human nature to think of these things. And so if we think of a question, it's probably 99% that somebody else has already thought about it already.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, all the questions that were proposed by the commentator, you could go to any YouTube and see people already defending the position using the same arguments that I've been making, you know, about Josephus and Justin Martyr, you know, the harmonization of the Gospels, the history, and so forth. So some people have already done it in YouTube and people have already done it in articles because this is something that has already been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is the unique thing about it is that all these things that maybe we are questioning about the Gospels or the Bible are already found in the internet and even books.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I really appreciate you coming in again, Edgar. You know, I'm thankful that you also stayed with us for the amount of time that this took, because I know your testimony was definitely very valuable, and you know, it provides so much foundation to understand, you know, a little bit more about history, a little bit more about, you know, other questions that, you know, scholars have thought about, have reasoned through, which helps us with our own questions today, and helps us with even the slightest thing, because like you mentioned, even if it's just a slight question or a thing that wasn't said, I think that might have been missed, you know, that still does not, you know, defy that the truth of the matter, right? The truth of what happened. And so I think you know, and if it does leave us with questions, it leaves us with a task to learn more, right? An opportunity to learn more. So really appreciate you coming in again, Edgar. Always appreciate you having making the time for us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing hopefully this conversation continues to be fruitful with everyone, with our community in the podcast. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, no problem.
And for all our viewers who were able to stay till the end of this video, thank you for being here. We really appreciate your presence, and we look forward to providing more content like this for you guys. So until next time, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.